Why is obedience so important to God? Because God wants to trust us. One of the best ways for God to be able to trust us is if we are obedient. God rewards obedience. When Daniel and his 3 friends were offered rations of food and wine from the king's own kitchens, Daniel resolved not to defile himself. This was because the food was different from their usual Jewish diet. Daniel and his friends proved that they were obedient to God, and God showed his appreciation. In Daniel 1 verse 17 it says, "As for these young men, God gave them knowledge and understanding in all skill and literature, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams." If he sees that we are obedient in the place that he has put us in, he will trust us to be obedient in a place where we can make a bigger difference. Daniel wasn't just obedient when he was a Judean exile at the court of Babylon, but he was obedient throughout his life up to that point. God saw this and placed him in what was at the time the political centre of Babylon. He was taken from his normal way of life into a strange new land where people follow different religions, different rules, different traditions. However, Daniel didn't compromise. He remained obedient and faithful for God, for he knew God had a plan. God saw Daniel's obedience and faith and placed him somewhere where he can make a bigger difference. Imagine you've just been kidnapped by the Americans and then placed in the White House, where the president of the time decides then to listen to you and take your advice, quite often as well, not just as a one-off. That's essentially what happened to Daniel. Daniel was taken from his normal way of life and moved into the White House, or at that time it was Babylon, the political centre, and he was taken as royalty listened to him and he listened to his advice because they thought he was wise. And he was, because he listened to God. He heard what God had to say about him and about all the different people in Babylon and actually what could make a difference. And Daniel did make a difference because of that, because he listened to God. Daniel didn't change his belief. He remained obedient even during that strange time. God doesn't just want us to be obedient when it suits us or when we feel like it. But actually God wants us to be obedient throughout our life. God wants us to be obedient when it's hard, when it's not so easy to be obedient. That's when he wants us to be faithful. That's when he wants us to follow him and listen to him. And actually right now that's one of those times, because we're living in a strange time. We're living in a time where it's difficult to just follow God, because we've not got that same contact with other Christians, we've not got that same communication with the church, because actually we're sort of isolated in this little bubbles. But actually God's still there. God's still with us. God's still listening to us. God still wants to do miracles. And actually, when you look at the Bible, I think you see that when God moves, it's often always through strange times. It's often through the times that are hard that God moves, because that's where he can make the biggest difference. And that's where he can use people to make the biggest difference. And that's why it's so important that we are obedient, because God wants to use people to perform miracles. God wants to use people to change lives. And if we're not listening to him, he can't do that. And that's why we're God's people. That's why God wants to use us, because we believe in him. And actually, we will listen to him. And we'll have slip-ups. All the characters in the Bible that followed Jesus had slip-ups. Even the main ones like Moses, Daniel, all these different characters, they all slipped up at different points. But that's part of being human. But they still listened to God. And they did awesome things. They did some crazy things that to us just seem like we'd never be able to do. But actually, with God, it's all possible. And that's what's so exciting. Since the start of COVID, I found myself getting quite excited about the idea of going to uni and doing all these cool things and actually being able to listen to God, and actually I can make a real difference at uni. I was thinking, all these different people I'm going to meet, all these lives I might be able to change with God's help, and actually even the new church I might be going to, I can make a difference there. But it just occurred to me, actually, God doesn't care about that. More recently, I've been thinking, God doesn't really care what I'm going to do in the future right now, because he cares about what I'm doing now. He doesn't think, oh, that was excellent, Josh, what you did in the past, because he cares what you're doing now. What can I do right now to make a difference? That's what God's thinking about. God's always speaking to us. God's always listening to us. So actually, there's always something we can do, even in the present. Even though it might feel like there's nothing to do because we're at home and there's no one to talk to, there's no real difference we can make. But actually, when we think about it, there's still Zooms we're going to, there's still meetings we're probably having to attend. I know I've got online lessons still. and I'm talking to my teachers and my classmates, it's a bit different, but I can still talk to them. I'm helping out with a vaccination. I know a lot of other people are as well. And that's a great time to talk to people. I know it might be in passing, but even then we can plant seeds that we don't get to see grow, but maybe they do eventually. And they become followers of Christ, and they can lead other people on. It's like a little chain reaction. And that's something that we can only do with God's help. That's something we can only do when listening to God. And that's why, actually, even during a time like this where it feels like it's not important, it's actually more important, because this is where people need to hear God and actually have to have some hope. And God is that. God is hope. So if we know we have something that we can offer, we have to try. And the way to do that is by following God, having obedience and listening to him. So I'll just leave you with this. How can I make a difference now? And actually, what does God want me to do? Thanks for listening.
Hi, I'm Hannah and I go to Bury Christian Fellowship, and today we're going to look at Daniel chapter 6 and talk about obedience and what it means to be obedient in our everyday lives. So Darius was a king of a place called Babylon, which is really fun to say, and he appointed over 100 governors and administrators, and then he appointed 3 people to be in charge of all those people. Daniel was really smart and he was really good at his job. And so the king decided to put him in charge of the whole kingdom. And he made the other 2 people in charge really jealous because he was the teacher's pet, if you like. Daniel's faithfulness had an impression on the king and people around him just by being obedient to God and to his job and doing it really well. The other leaders saw Daniel and they were really jealous of him. Your obedience and the person you are, the way you shine your light in the community and stand out, can cause people to be jealous of you, because they see that and they want what you have. So these guys, they plotted to get rid of Daniel. They tried to look for ways to get rid of him, but they found it really difficult because he was so trustworthy. There were no scandals to use against him, so they knew the only way to get back at him was going to have to be a religious thing. So the other 2 guys and some governors plotted together about what they could do, and they spoke to the king and made him make a law that no one should be allowed to pray for 30 days, and if they do, then they have to be thrown into a lion's den. The king agreed to make this law, and then Daniel finds out about it, but what I love about what he does next is it shows his obedience to God. That is that the first thing Daniel did when he found out there was a law saying you could not pray. Daniel prayed in his room, but with his windows wide open. I think this just shows how important God was to Daniel. He prioritized God even though he knew the risks. He still decided to risk everything so that he could be obedient to God. He chose to prioritize God over the letter of the law. I think we should prioritize to pray when we are under attack in our circumstances and trust that God has it under control. And Daniel knew that. The guys found him praying illegally and they told the king. Daniel was probably one of the king's very good friends, and I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to throw one of my best friends into a pit of hungry lions. And the king didn't want to either. He was very upset about the fact that Daniel had to get put in this lion's pit. So he worked all day to try and find a way to not throw him in there. The next part I absolutely love. Darius doesn't believe in the same God as Daniel, but I love what he says next. He says, "Your God, who you serve continually, is going to get you out of this." And I find that amazing because Daniel's obedience to God had such an effect on Darius that he thought maybe this God is real. Maybe God will actually get him out of this den. And this is something you can think about for your own lives. When you are being yourself, doing what God says, being obedient to what he tells you to do, spreading love and being truthful and trustworthy, just like Daniel. Yes, there are people who are not going to like you, who are going to be jealous of you. There are people who will try and throw you into a lion's den, only metaphorically, I hope. But there will also be people, even if it's just one person, who will see that type of person you are, notice that you're a Christian, and be like, you know what? They have this amazing joy and trust and hope, and I want that. And they might not ever say that to your face, but God will use your obedience to him to witness to others in powerful ways. Darius says that Daniel served God continually. And that means always, not just when we feel like it. Daniel tried to be obedient always, even when it was illegal in the letter of the law. What was really important was that he tried to be obedient in private and in public, in all circumstances. So the king doesn't sleep all night, he can't sleep, he's wondering about whether Daniel is alive or if he's been eaten, and he hurries to the pit really early in the morning and he's like, "Yo man, you still alive?" And Daniel basically replies and he's like, "Yeah man, still alive, God saved me, woo!" So Daniel was alive because he was obedient to God, even when people plotted against him. And there might be situations in our lives, metaphorically, where we want to feel comfortable rather than risking the lion's den. Because it's much nicer up here, there's no danger of being eaten. Being obedient to God doesn't mean we will always be comfortable, and at times we might feel like we are in a lion's den. But if this is something God has asked you to do, then He will protect you and guide you and fill you with peace, and He won't let lions touch you, even if you feel surrounded. Then Darius is really happy that Daniel is alive and he hasn't been eaten for breakfast by these lions. So he's like, "Yeah man, woo!" And he basically starts praising God, which is amazing. I think that would be so cool if one of my friends saw that I was being obedient to God and then decided to become a Christian. In conclusion, Daniel was continually obedient to God, and because of that it shone through and had an effect on people around him, because they noticed that in him, and some people were jealous, and Darius wanted to know more about God. I challenge you to be obedient to God continually, not just when you feel like it, even if that means stepping out of your comfort zone. You aren't alone in the lion's den.